Photography long preceded writing. I had no idea I could write, really, until I went to college and started doing student journalism.
Because hello, welcome to Evil O. This is Wazo X Wazo, today coming from Delhi again. And I'm sitting with somebody who really needs no introduction, author of many, many history books that are so exciting. But many people don't know he's also a photographer. He's come out with some marvelous photography books. And I'll say right away, when I first realized you were doing photography, I was thinking, oh, so now Dalrymple's capitalizing on his name and, you know, putting out photography books. But when I really looked at your photos, I realized they were glorious. They're just wonderful. And then when I actually started reading, I realized you really have a background in photography, which I didn't know. So let's start this conversation. Sure. Tell us about how you got interested in photography.
Well, for me, photography long preceded writing. I had no idea I could write, really, until I went to college and started doing student journalism. But photography was what I did as a kid. My father was a keen amateur photographer and was photographing us all as we grew up, so there were cameras around in the house. And when my grandmother died, she left little money, and I bought a good camera, an SLR, with a really lovely Leica.
It was a Leica, okay.
It wasn't a Leica. It had a Leica T-Star Carl Zeiss lens.
Okay.
The same lens as in the Leica. It was something called a Contax, which I don't think exists anymore. But it was a really nice camera, and by that stage already, I knew how to develop my own black and whites, and was spending a lot of my time at school in the darkroom. And as today, a lot of my photography came out of my travels. At that stage at school, it was just me on a bicycle going around the moors of Yorkshire. I went to this slightly weird monastic school in the North Yorkshire moors.
And you love the darkroom.
And I loved the whole thing. I loved going out on my bicycle. I liked school, but it was lovely to get away from it. And I used to go out on every opportunity when other kids were going to watch rugby matches or whatever. I had a very sympathetic housemaster who was very happy to let me go off and do things rather other than play muscular games.
Right.
And I used to go off. I was a keen. I really had the same interests as I do now. I was a keen historian.
Well, you have a very cinematic eye, actually, and I should have suspected you'd be a good photographer because when I was reading The Last Mughal, there were scenes in there that I was like, God, this seems like this could be on the big screen. I felt like I was watching it on the big screen because you write your history books in a manner that aren't dry, but they're very visual, you know?
It's interesting you say that because for me, the photography and the writing come out of, although they're complementary in a life sense, in that when I'm traveling for my research, for my books,
right,
I come across the photographs which make it into the photographic work. But they come from very different parts of the brain.
Right.
My writing is enormously considered and planned and thought about in advance. Each one of these books takes 5 years research, hence all the books behind you, from which are the raw materials of previous books. And nothing is done by chance. I'm not like a novelist who sort of conjures stuff out of thin air. It's all planned, and then it's multiply edited. Everything you read has gone through multiple edits. So it's a slow, painstaking, deliberate, conscious, intellectual process. While photography is almost the opposite.
There is the joy of being out there and seeing things.
The opposite in that. While there's certainly an editing process, which is a big part of the work, the actual taking of the photograph is immediate, intuitive, instant, and non-intellectual.
Well, I find when I look at your books, this was his first book, The Writer's Eye. This is your first, correct?
Yep, correct.
Which is this is actually my favorite, probably.
Thank
I
you.
love this so much. But one thing I notice when I look at these is like you're really good with landscapes.
That's
You
what
have
I
an
used to
eye
do.
for landscapes, I would say, which is a little more thoughtful and composed. It's more like a writer would approach something, I think.
I suspect that comes from the fact that, as I said, I went to school in the middle of fucking nowhere. And, it was the opposite of going to college in New York or something. I was out in the North Yorkshire moors, and there was the school, and then it was just sheep country.
Right.
And gorgeous. I mean, I still love going back there. Most people run away from their schools never to return ever again. But I make a point of revisiting that area because it's as beautiful as anywhere I've ever been since. But there, up in those moors, I began to look at the works of landscape photographers as a teenager. And I say the school was a kind of odd school, and it was run by monks and in all sorts of ways deeply ultra-conservative. But it had, there was some very sympathetic, artistic men working there, men specifically. There was one woman teacher who was a great influence too, but she was one, literally one woman.
Okay.
And they had lots of books on photography in the library, and I remember going through Don McCullen's Hearts of Darkness and all the Bill Brandt books.
Yeah, you love Bill Brandt, and you can see that in your photography so much.
Well, Bill Brandt's work immediately, I mean, the North Yorkshire Moors is Heathcliff territory. It's dark, brooding.
Right.
It's winter 9 months of the year. it's amazing storms, and I mean, it's very dramatic, but it's not clement. It's the opposite, and that darkness that Bill Brandt, who was also someone from the north of England,
right,
and whose a lot of early work was based around geographically close to where I was, Newcastle and Jarrow and Tyneside, the depressed industrial north, which when Bill was first photographing in the 30s was at the height of it, sort of depression and the Jarrow March, and it was the one place that Marxism had a real following in Britain.
And yet many of your photographs in this book were actually taken in Afghanistan, near the Bamya Buddhas, in a place which I think was called like the spot of light or something like that. It's very opposite.
But I have shot it in such a way that it looks quite dark. You're right. And that, in a sense, is the trick, to find somewhere that is dramatically lit. Because even the North Yorkshire Moors, when the sun came out, you had this world, this beautiful, wild world unfolding. And yet, if you edited cleverly, it was very, very atmospheric. The time I used to enjoy photographing most, oddly enough, was during a thaw, after a snow. It got thick snow in winter in those days.
Well, you do what we used to call in photography school, you do journalist burns once in a while, if you know what I'm talking about. You burn in the skies really heavy, but that was
and
like,
I used to love doing all that stuff.
That a lot.
I used to, burning in, then you'd occasionally print through a very coarse handkerchief or something to get the texture, different textures, and I used to love playing all those tricks. I subscribed to photography magazines and tried out all that stuff and filters.
But you have a pictorialist eye. Once in a while you get a little Cartier-Bresson, but not that often. Generally it's quite heavily pictorialist to me.
Well, funny enough, Bresson was late for me. I don't think there was a book on Bresson at the school library, and I discovered Bresson, I think, at college, Cambridge. And again, immediately loved that. I loved the immediacy of it. Bizarrely, you mentioned Bresson. Immediately after, just during lockdown, I was in Venice, and there was this massive show of Bresson over the whole of one of those big palaces, and it had 6 curators, each of whom chose their 50 favorite Bressons.
Really.
And one of them was Anne Leibovitz and so on. They were another was Wim Wenders. And it was very interesting seeing what different people chose, because sometimes there was 1 or 2 photographs that appeared always in everyone's selection, but by and large they were quite different. And you had the sort of double edit of Bresson's own eye, then the choice of the photographer or the filmmaker who was choosing them.
But you do catch that once in a while. Some of your photographs of the Muslim school children, I think it is. There's one maybe in this book or the other book where you get that Bresson feeling. But the thing I love is, we're going to insert images, is his landscapes. Your landscapes are incredible.
I like photographing landscapes, and it was what I always used to photograph. Portraits and landscapes were the 2 things I worked on most as a kid.
But you have that whole sense of light and shade. It's just... I'm inserting images so you can see these more clearly, but it's incredible.
the thing that Bresson taught me, I think, was that what matters is not equipment.
No.
But to have something that's in your pocket and always there and is discreet and anonymous.
I want to get to this point because one of our first lessons in photography school, they made us all go out and buy a plastic Holga that shot 12 photos on a roll, and you were to make the best photos possible with your plastic Holga, and that was the lesson. It was that it's not the equipment, but it's what you do with it, which always has that sexual innuendo to it too. But I mean, that's what they teach photographers. And I like the fact that, and people may not know this, that you shoot with your Samsung Galaxy Note.
I used to, I still have, the old Contax with its wonderful lens, and I've got a Nikon DSLR, but I hardly use it.
Do you use a Galaxy Note 5 or?
Currently, I'm using a Galaxy S9. I think is what it's called. But they're really good lenses, and the light meters are extraordinary. They manage to record things in incredibly extreme light conditions where you'd normally be scratching your head with an SLR.
Well, that's what I know. Even when doing these interviews, like I can do the same scene with my phone, and sometimes it adjusts so quickly and so perfectly. It's like, why am I even using this?
Yep.
You know. So
I've now only do, and obviously there's a huge amount you lose. I've just been on a trip in Madhya Pradesh, and I was shooting a lot of sculpture, and I constantly missed having a really good telephoto lens, that 200mm or something that got you right up there. And occasionally I miss having a 28mm wide angle, or because again, for landscapes you can do wonderful stuff with those. But what you gain with the phone is the speed. You just whip it out, and it's always in your pocket. I mean, one never ever knowingly leaves the phone behind.
They would always tell us you have to bring your camera with you all the time. But when you're carrying around a big Rolleiflex or whatever, like I used to, that becomes really heavy, and a tripod and everything else.
And by the time you've set it up, the thing's gone, or
exactly.
or the moment is gone, or the person has got bored.
So I want to just bring up your second book here, which is The Historian's Eye, William Dalrymple, and I love the photographs in here too, but I actually kind of like the first book better, and I'll tell you why, because this one doesn't have the history. Because, sometimes when I go to a fort and things, I just love to look at it and enjoy the aesthetics, and I don't necessarily have to know all the dates and the names. And this you put in dates and names and things. But anyway, talk about this book.
So the first book came out of a lovely opportunity that was organized by a young writer based in Bombay called Siddharth Danvant-Shangvi. And Siddharth just saw my pictures on Facebook, I think, or Instagram, and said, would you like to do a show? And I thought he was joking, because, these were just cell phone snaps.
Right.
And I said, you realize I haven't got a great fancy Nikon. This is literally all taken on the phone. And he said, no worry, that's now become very fashionable. And he named 2 or 3 people like Sunita Borawala and Raghu Rai, who'd recently done cell phone shows.
Okay.
So I said, why the hell not? It involved a nice holiday down in Goa, and so we got the whole thing off. And then a friend in HarperCollins, who was also a Facebook friend, spotted the conversation and said, would you like to do a catalogue?
Wow.
And it all happened. So it happened very organically in a matter of 3 months. Nothing was taken specially for the show. It was just stuff that was lying around. And
this was the first book,
The Writer's Eye.
And
it was an instant idea.
No time to write any text.
It was lovely. And the text came pretty quickly, because stuff I'd been thinking about anyway. So I just wrote it in a day. The second one was a slightly different process, in that it very much came out of the journeys, research trips I did for the Anarchy. When I was working, the Anarchy is my most recent book. It was a 5-6 year project about the East India Company, and in a way the summation of everything I've been doing the last 20 years. And involved lots of travel. And so it's a slightly bigger book, because there's slightly more journeys. And certainly it was put together over a longer time frame. But as you say, maybe it lacks the kind of immediacy of that first heady rush when you suddenly realize that you can put a show together.
The second book seems much more thought out. And I sort of like the
Exactly that.
spontaneity of the first one.
Well, you're absolutely right. The first one was totally spontaneous. It was
Right.
just it was available material,
Yeah,
literally.
yeah,
It was
yeah.
just collected together. Didn't have a theme. There was no binding element. It was just what was on my phone. The one thing I should say about technicals, although there are, I mean, virtually no technicals, is I just use this free editing suite that comes with Google called Snapseed.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And it's astonishing.
I actually learned about that from you.
You use it too
Yeah,
now?
yeah, from reading your book. When you mentioned Snapseed, I think, well, I don't have that. I'm using Afterlight, so I downloaded it. Does wonders.
I got as far as nearly downloading one of those other fancy ones, and then thought, why this does everything I need.
Snapseed does, it's like having Photoshop in your pocket almost.
And it's become, particularly if I'm on a journey, when I'm taking lots of photographs. In the last couple of weeks, I've been traveling in Madhya Pradesh. It's rather like you see old ladies knitting in Britain, doing woolies for their grandchildren or something, and I've always rather envied old ladies knitting because it's something you can do while you're talking. It occupies a tiny bit of it occupies your hands, and, but not your brain in a sense. And the same is true of editing, that you can sit there having a conversation with someone. And you're just slightly upping the contrast, or making it slightly darker, or trying this filter, or cropping it in a slightly different way.
You're not putting on rubber gloves to protect yourself from the selenium toner.
Oh, I'm so grateful not to. I mean, I loved my times in the darkroom were some of my happiest times.
But all those chemical
those
poisons.
chemicals, those fixer.
I loved being in the darkroom too, but when I look back, it's like, God, I would spend 2 days to come up with one really good print.
It's true.
You know, in the old days.
And there was always dust somewhere in the process, whether it was on the
There's
lens.
always
And if you're photographing here, there was always those scratches on the
And
negative
you have to
somehow.
spot it up with those little touch-up pens.
And I was so bad with that. I was so bad at touching up. But it's very interesting because I find myself, I mean, really I have a gap. I was photographing with intent and for exhibitions in my early teens up to about when I was 20. And then really it stopped. I mean, I just taking pictures of babies and things, you know, when the kids were growing up. And,
Oh, you focused on writing.
And I focused on writing, and all my creativity went into that. And then, as soon as I discovered Snapseed, I realized you could do the sorts of images I'd always liked, these dark, broody images.
And we didn't mention, but you have a very famous photographer in your family. Your great-great-great aunt, I think.
That's right, Julia Margaret Cameron.
It was always one of my favorite photographers, too. And I was always inspired by her years ago. I mean, I went back 30 years or whatever, you know, by her tableaus that she would do, which I still like to play
It's more
with.
your sort of photography than mine, in a sense.
Yes, it is.
In that it's created and art and worked on and sculpted, in a sense, in a way that mine isn't. But she is the source. She and her sister, who was my great-grandmother, is the source of my Indian blood, because Julia Margaret's granny was Bengali.
Oh, okay.
And she was a Hindu woman who converted to Catholicism to marry a Frenchman. And Julia Margaret was a unusually ugly woman with 5 much less talented, beautiful sisters.
I always assumed she was a lesbian for some reason, but I don't know.
No, well, certainly she seemed to have a very happy marriage, which doesn't mean she wasn't a lesbian, but I've never seen any reason.
No reason to believe that.
She certainly has the eye for female beauty and night photographing.
And she wasn't afraid of technicalities.
She apparently
Just got
famously
right in there.
stank of fixer. She was always dripping it over herself, getting it on her dress. And there's very funny descriptions by Tennyson, because they lived next door to each other on the Isle of Wight. Julia Margaret grew up in Calcutta, and I said there were these 5 sisters who were very Indian looking. If you look at them today, I mean, you can instantly see they've got Indian blood. They're very dark hair, dark eyes, but because they were half French, they were able to escape the Raj's strict colour consciousness. And so while they were very obviously Indian, everyone kind of knew they were Indian, and they spoke Hindi or Bengali among themselves, even when they were back in England in later life, and wore Indian clothes, and they've got Rakis on their hands in the pictures. They nonetheless were accepted into colonial society, although there were mutters of racism, of dark skin, of touch of the tar brush, all that sort of Victorian thing in memoirs at the time. But they were also socially ambitious and rather forceful women. And one of them, called Sarah, who was another of I think the second sister, was married to a director of the East India Company, who was a guy called Henry Prinsep. And Prinsep's an interesting character. For example, he was the guy who took on Macaulay when Macaulay tried to make English the language.
Yes.
He was the guy who was defending Sanskrit and vernacular languages. And when he retired with his wife to England, with my great-grandmother coming as the younger sister back, as a sort of, gap year, almost a sort of gap year of being brought back, they started having these very unusual Sunday lunches in the quiet of a Victorian London Sunday, where everything was church and hymn singing and kneeling and all that sort of thing. And Sarah Prinsep started these lunches where the whole of artistic London would come. And the draw was her housemate, the guy who she'd welcomed into the house and gave studio, who's a guy called Watts, who not considered to be a particularly great painter now, but at the time considered to be England's greatest painter. Funny, reputation has sunk. But he was the inspiration behind the whole school of younger artists who became the Pre-Raphaelites. So Burne-Jones was around and had an affair with my great-grandmother. We've got the letters and the album he drew for her.
You can't come from a more interesting family.
I'm quite lucky like that. And
well, we've strayed away from photography quite a bit.
Anyway, all this stuff was around, and Julia used to take these, to get back to photography, Julia used to take all these people at the Sunday lunch and do their portraits. So all those Julia Margaret Cameron portraits were generally people that her sister had invited to lunch and she had kidnapped.
And said, come.
And she'd come,
we're going to dress you up as something and
they
do a
stick
photo
a beard
of you.
on and Tennyson would have a crown.
And you're going to become Merlin.
And you're Merlin. And then somebody else was the Lady of the Lake, and Guinevere would be the serving girl, and the Cardinal Vaughan was made to be a prince or a knight or something.
So I just want to ask you one question. So you have a little Indian blood in you, correct?
Yep, correct.
Does that protect you from charges of Orientalism or exotifying or anything? We're not talking about your books, talking about your photographs. I'm just curious.
I wish.
You wish?
No, I'm like you know all too well. It's a complicated world being a Gora, a Farangi, a white person operating in post-colonial India. I have spent 30 years writing against colonialism. My major work, the Company Quartet, is a massive demolition of the East India Company. And its plunder
the
of
Anarchy
India.
is
But the assumption remains, you're white, you're a colonialist.
Right.
And you're guilty until proved innocent. And anyone that's read the work is very happy to prove me innocent, but most people haven't.
Right. It's like, why is this guy writing about this? Yes.
So the assumption is that, that you are, if you are a white guy operating in India, you are an Orientalist. And I've now been here 35 years and everyone knows me, so in a sense they've got bored of saying that if they've said it.
I think the same has become of me.
Yeah.
Most people are just bored of it. They think I bring it up too much now. It's like, might as well get over it,
I think you just got to, I mean, everyone comes with a backpack of advantages and disadvantages. Yes. You can be beautiful, you can be intelligent, you can be one colour, you can be dazzlingly a different colour. We all have things that help our lives, and we all have things which slightly hold us back.
You can be agile, or you can be clumsy. I mean,
exactly, and you can have talents or not. And it's you just, in a sense, really just got to get on with what I think you operate as well as you can in the given scenario.
I think that's kind of a good note to end on. This has gone on rather long. So anyway, I'm going to end it. Is it okay?
It's fine.
Okay, so thank you, William.
Thank you.
Can we do this
We can.
in this COVID era? Thank you for joining Evil O, Wazo X Wazo. Please make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel keep going. And see you next time. Now you have to wave.
I'll wave.
We'll do
Bye-bye.
the wave. Bye. Bye.